Spain offers one of the most extraordinary laboratories for studying the Middle Ages. It rarely fits neatly into the categories that historians often use for other European kingdoms. Instead, the Iberian Peninsula developed through a convergence of geography, languages, religions, and artistic traditions that produced a society both deeply fragmented and profoundly interconnected. Geography is the first key to understanding this world. Before railways, highways, and airplanes eased the distance, mountains shaped nearly every aspect of life on the peninsula. The great ranges across Iberia created pockets of communication that did not always align with political borders. Communities separated by ridges and valleys could develop distinct dialects, customs, and loyalties, even when they lived relatively close to one another. In the 11th century, for example, speakers in Galicia could often understand people living further south in what is now Portugal, yet they might struggle to understand the speech of Leon or Castile across the mountains. The peninsula was filled with Romance dialects, and even a river such as the Pisuerga could mark a boundary between different political cultures and regional identities. When we speak about Spain in the Middle Ages, we must therefore imagine a mosaic rather than a unified kingdom. Alongside this geographical fragmentation stood one of the most remarkable cultural mixtures in medieval Europe. After the Islamic conquest of 711, Muslims ruled much of the peninsula, while large Christian and Jewish communities continued to live there. These societies inherited artistic and architectural traditions of earlier civilizations that had occupied Iberia, including the Romans and the Visigoths, and they expanded them in new directions. Under the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba and later the Taifa kingdoms, a sophisticated court culture developed whose visual language drew on both Mediterranean and Islamic traditions. Over time, Christians, Muslims, and Jews across the peninsula shared elements of this visual vocabulary. Many scholars today describe this phenomenon as Islamicate, a term used to refer to cultural forms that developed within Islamic societies, but were not limited to Muslims alone. In Christian territories, patrons often employed Muslim craftsmen or adopted architectural techniques that had developed in Al-Andalus. This phenomenon is commonly called mudéjar, referring to artistic production in Christian contexts. They used forms associated with Islamic architecture. Yet the boundary between mudéjar works and those created by Muslim patronage is often difficult to draw. Courts on both sides of the frontier exchange objects, artisans, and visual ideas. Rather than belonging to one religious community, many artistic forms circulated across political and confessional boundaries. At the same time, Iberia was not defined only by this Islamicate tradition. The peninsula also received powerful influences from northern Europe and from North Africa. Positioned between the Pyrenees and the Strait of Gibraltar, Iberia served as a crossroads between two large cultural spheres. Romanesque architecture spread widely across the northern Christian kingdoms. In regions such as Burgos, Romanesque churches filled the landscape, and monasteries became major centers of economic production, religious life, and learning. Many villages built churches whose scale and ornament rivaled that of cathedrals. In some places, interaction of traditions becomes strikingly visible. At the monastery of Santo Domingo de Silos, Romanesque capitals and sculpted pillars coexist with wooden ceilings constructed using techniques associated with mudéjar carpentry. In the Cathedral of Burgos, one can pass from a Gothic cloister that reveals the transition of Romanesque to Gothic architecture into a chapter house whose ceiling is formed by a tauhel, mudéjar roof. Instead of Arabic inscriptions, however, the walls bear Latin texts. Medieval patrons saw no contradiction in placing these artistic traditions side by side. Yet modern observers sometimes interpret history through the lens of a clash of civilizations, assuming that Christian and Islamic cultures must have existed in permanent opposition. The artistic landscape of Iberia suggests something far more complex. In many contexts, the forms associated with Islamic and Christian traditions complemented one another rather than competing. By the late 15th century, styles such as Isabelline Gothic emerged, combining elaborate Gothic architecture with decorative elements drawn from the earlier Islamicate vocabulary. To an untrained eye, these buildings might appear as purely Gothic. Yet careful observation reveals vegetal patterns and ornamental motifs that reflect centuries of artistic exchange. Heraldic shields proclaim the authority of the Catholic monarchs on cathedral facades, while the surrounding decoration still bears traces of artistic languages that developed in Al-Andalus. The Iberian Peninsula thus occupied a unique position between the two broad civilizations of the medieval world. To the north lay the feudal societies of Christian Europe, while to the south stretched the urban and administrative cultures of the Islamic Mediterranean. Each possessed its own religious traditions, legal systems, calendars, and ritual practices. Christians spoke of the Trinity, and Muslims of oneness in God, through Tawhid. Even military practices differed, including techniques of horsemanship and forms of combat. Yet from the arrival of Muslim armies in 711 until the expulsion of Jews and Muslims between the late 15th and early 17th centuries, these societies interacted continuously. Their coexistence shaped the political and cultural identity that later became Spain. This history also shaped the early modern Spanish Empire. When Spain expanded across the Atlantic and into the Pacific, it carried with it traditions that had developed through centuries of cultural interaction on the peninsula. The empire that ruled territories from the Americas to the Philippines defined itself strongly as Catholic, often invoking a Visigothic past in order to contrast itself with the Muslim world of North Africa. Yet traces of Iberia's earlier cultural encounters remained visible. Spanish contained thousands of Arabic loanwords. Noble women in the Americas sometimes adopted fashions described as a la morisca, covering themselves in public. Mudéjar ceilings appeared in churches across Latin America, and irrigation systems, known as acequias, were carried to places such as San Antonio in Texas. Techniques of navigation that enabled Iberian voyages across the oceans also drew on the collaborative work of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars. Understanding this background helps explain why the study of medieval Spain remains so important today. Iberian expansion in the early modern period reshaped much of the globe. Spanish influence spread across the Americas and the Pacific world. In the United States, large regions once formed part of New Spain, and Spanish settlements such as Santa Fe, today in New Mexico, predate many English colonial towns. The history of the Americas cannot be fully understood without recognizing the Iberian foundations that preceded later national narratives. Typically, the Middle Ages of the Iberian Peninsula are a somewhat niche subject, yet they illuminate how cultures interact, how political identities are formed, and how artistic traditions circulate across boundaries. The symbols of power carved into medieval buildings, the rhetoric used in religious polemics, the diplomatic exchanges of gifts and objects, and the architectural spaces designed for ritual all reveal patterns that continue to shape societies today. By studying how these processes unfolded in medieval Iberia, we gain insight into the enduring relationship between culture, power, and identity in the modern world.